Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pestana. And we're here today with special guest, Dr. Bernard Beitman, who's here to share with us his new book, Meaningful Coincidences: How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. So, Dr. Beitman is the first psychiatrist since Carl Jung to systemize the study of coincidences. A graduate from Yale Medical School, he did his psychiatry residency at Stanford University. He's the former chair of psychiatry at the University of Missouri Columbia Medical School for over 17 years. He writes a blog for Psychology Today on coincidence, is the co-author of an award-winning book, Learning Psychotherapy, and the founder of the Coincidence Project. So let's welcome to the show, Dr. Bernard Beitman.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you, Marianne.
Oh my goodness, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. What inspired you to write this?
I'm a high frequency coincider, which means I see a lot of coincidences and have all of my life. I'm currently working on a kind of coincidence memoir that gathers all the coincidences I've had in my life that I can remember or wrote down. There's been a lot of them. So that's how I got into them. Some pretty striking. And I'm an academic, or at least a recovering academic, no longer in an academic institution, but I was institutionalized for more than 50 years. So it's hard to get rid of that. So I want to study coincidences. I want to bring coincidences into a scientific perspective. And those two things, having a lot of coincidences in my life and the desire to make this something we could study scientifically, are the two driving forces that got me to write that book.
Well, I'm grateful that you're a recovering academic. I mean, I think a lot of times people, while they look at things that happen within their lifetime, they see certain numbers all the time or what have you, they're always wanting to see the science that backs this up. And I'm actually one of those people too.
To start a new science, which I'm trying to do, you first need to have a good description of what you're studying. As you probably know from what you just said, there's been a lot of talk about coincidences. People see a lot of them, but it hasn't been organized. The field hasn't been organized into something that we understand in a way that can be studied scientifically. And my book, Meaningful Coincidences: How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen, is an attempt to define this new field.
So when we look at a coincidence, what does that really mean? What's the definition of that?
Well, let me give you two definitions, because it's important to distinguish, at least beginning to distinguish, between a coincidence and a meaningful coincidence. The basic dictionary definition of coincidences is the remarkable concurrence of events or circumstances without an apparent causal connection between the events. And without apparent is key in that, because it suggests that, well, maybe there is a cause, but we don't know what it is. A meaningful coincidence is also coming together of two or more events in a surprising, unexpected, and improbable way, but seems to have significance to the person experiencing it, either in the moment or in retrospect, and may seem to have a possible explanation. It's important on that one to recognize that my buddies in statistics, David Hand being one of them in England, just says, it's all random, Bernie. It's all random, but you can still find meaning in them. And even for the random guys, there is meaning in some coincidences. So meaningful is an important thing for the person experiencing them.
So as we start taking a deeper look into what a coincidence is, as we go throughout our day, how do we identify coincidences and what would fall within that paradigm?
Well, they happen all the time. The real question you're asking is fundamental. How do you know which ones to pay attention to? Well, it's a lot like a lot of things. Like, what foods do you like? What people do you like? Which ones don't you like? You got to try them out. You got to see if there's something to them. So if you see a coincidence, you got to see if maybe there's something to it for you, or what I like to do is see not only what it can do for me personally, but also what it tells me about how reality works. But you got to like taste them. You got to look at them. You got to pay attention to them. And why pay attention to them? Because they're very useful. Not all the time. There are some ones that throw you off, but they tend to be very useful. They can help with decision making, help with spiritual development, help in interpersonal relationships, and lots of other ways. So they are useful to you if you pay attention to them. They can be useful if you don't pay attention to them. I've seen that happen plenty of times. But when you start paying attention to them, you start to wonder, you become curious, and you try to see what they can do to help you understand what you're doing and how your relationships work and what your connection with reality is.
So, how do we get to this point where we're going through our life is happening, and we're trying to bring some kind of order or understanding to the coincidences that are happening around us?
That's why my book was written. How do you bring order to all this apparent chaos? You try to understand more clearly and use categories, useful categories that can give you some idea about what your view of experiences with coincidence is. One of the important things to remember is that we differ. We're different people. And while there are categories that people fall into, I don't know what category you would be in, Marianne. I don't know what kinds of coincidences you experience, because people experience often a certain kind of coincidences. And in the book, I ask a question at the beginning of a chapter: what kind of coincider are you? Again, a coincider is someone who experiences coincidences. And coinciders vary in what kinds of coincidences they pay attention to. One person, for example, just uses them primarily for interpersonal relationships. Sharon Rowlett has written a couple of books about meaningful coincidences, and particularly her one about her relationships is a demonstration of how she uses coincidences to understand and develop her interpersonal relationships. Other people have different ways of using them, and Squire Rushnell has written a bunch of little books that have great coincidence stories. And his aim is to, again, alert people to the existence of meaningful coincidences, which he calls God winks, but also to emphasize from his perspective that they illustrate God in operation, and particularly his view of a Christian God. So that's another reason people pay attention to coincidences.
I often hear of people who have a loved one that passed and they see dimes all over the place as a way of communication in very improbable places. So it's interesting when we look for those kind of markers, how they show up.
Indeed. A graduate student wrote her dissertation for her PhD on the use of meaningful coincidences in helping people who are grieving. It's happens a lot, and people report them. One of them that has stuck in my mind was a story of a woman coming back from the funeral of her husband, and it was winter. It was cold, and as they walked back into the house that he used to live in, his favorite flower had bloomed right in front of the staircase, and it was winter. This flower didn't bloom then, but she took it as his telling her that he was blooming where he was.
You got to love that. You got to, and people get such positive feedback or positive emotion when they connect that way with coincidence.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. That's part of the fun of it. There are coincidences that have longer term effects, but I have a Psychology Today blog, and one of my recent ones was about the ephemeral nature of meaningful coincidences, meaning that sometimes all you get is the now of the coincidence. It feels good right now. And that's enough sometimes, not to have to look for more meaning about the future or the past. Just there's a now instruction in some coincidence saying, all we got is now. Just enjoy this one. It's really cool.
I love that. I think that's such a positive thing. Now, are there like common forms of coincidence that people tend to have?
Well, that was part of my research. You ask about the science of meaningful coincidences. So, as a good scientist, I had to ask. Well, I've seen them, and I hear other people have. Um, I know I've heard stories, but just can we systematically ask the question: how many people experience meaningful coincidences, and what kind do they experience with greater or lesser regularity? So I put together, with the help of some psychology research students, the Weird Coincidence Survey. The Weird Coincidence Survey currently is a measure of how sensitive people are to coincidences. And that survey can be taken at my website, coincider.com, COINCIDER, coincider.com. And you can get an estimate of how sensitive you are to coincidences. But that wasn't why we did it. I wanted to answer the question is, how many people and what kind of coincidences do they experience? So we got about 1,000 people at the University of Missouri, and all walks of life, students, faculty, people who worked in administration and who took care of the lawns and the buildings, who filled out the Weird Coincidence Survey. And we were able to come up with 4 common coincidences. And these common coincidences, I think you might recognize, a lot of people do, is you think of somebody, and it's the good ones are when you think of somebody and it's really strong, but you haven't had contact with that person for quite a while, and they contact you. I mean, you thought of them, they contact you, and then you go, "What? I was just thinking about you. I just thought about you yesterday, and I hadn't thought about you in a couple of years." Now, if your mother calls, and she calls every day and she calls around the same time, you can predict that one. You know who's going to be, you have an explanation for that. But the ones that you haven't heard from for a couple of years contact you, get you to wonder, how'd that happen? Now, what's the probability of that? What are the odds? And that's one of the most common coincidences, to think of someone and they unexpectedly contact you. There are 3 others that were common, the most common in our survey out of 9 items we had on the survey. One of my favorite is, I think of a question only to have it answered by an external source, like radio, TV, or other people. I mean, it can sometimes overhear a conversation and say, well, I needed to know that. It's kind of like, well, how did that happen that I needed to know it and that person is talking about that? How'd that happen? So that's fun. I mean, when you have a question and then you get the answer without trying to do anything about it. Sometimes, and quite commonly, I think of an idea and hear or see it on the radio, TV, or internet, and a lot of times that idea is a song. You think of a song, and there it is on the radio, and you got to wonder how that happens. It does wonder, and people who are very scientifically oriented like to say it's all random, and they come up with random ways of suggesting how it works. But random isn't the best explanation sometimes. It's we don't know. And I have some idea. I think it's a kind of telepathy that we're all capable of. I don't know. I perhaps you'd like to have me describe the Sissy Spacek story about her and the radio.
I would love for you to do that.
Thank you. I'd like to do it. She lives near Charlottesville, where I am. So it's kind of fun to hear people running into her at Whole Foods and stuff. But this was a while back. She never liked being told what to do. So when singer Loretta Lynn started telling gossip columnists and hosts of daytime and nighttime talk shows that Sissy was going to play Loretta in the movie A Coal Miner's Daughter, even though no such deal had been made. Sissy made sure she had to meet this woman. And just to go off into the future, we have a concert series here that's outdoors, and to see Sissy and Loretta Lynn on stage together was quite a treat. But that happened later. So Loretta wanted her to play A Coal Miner's Daughter, and that was about Loretta's life. So they met for the first time in a parking lot outside Loretta's tour bus in Shreveport, Louisiana. What a place Shreveport is. I've been there. The power of Loretta's personality instantly convinced Sissy to play this woman. But she also had some misgivings. How could she play a real person who was still living? The director then told her she didn't fit the part, but Universal Studios was still pressing her to take the part, as was her agent. Her manager was advising against it. So she was in the middle of this intense push and pull. So she and her husband, Jack, flew into Washington, D.C. to visit his mom, Jerry. She lived in a high-rise apartment building and drove a big white Cadillac and didn't like country music. She didn't like it. Her car radio was always tuned to classical. She knew little about Loretta. When she heard Sissy's dilemma, she suggested prayer. Sissy jokingly asked for a sign from God. Now, this asking for a sign from God or the universe is quite common for people to do, and sometimes it works. And we'll see what happened here. So they were watching TV later that evening and saw Loretta tell another talk show host, this time the famous Johnny Carson, that Sissy would take the role. Sissy got really mad and asked Jack to go for a drive with her. As they drove away in Jerry's Cadillac, you guessed it, the radio started up with Loretta singing A Coal Miner's Daughter. Well, what can you do? Somehow Jerry's classical music station had turned into something else. Sissy decided then and there to do the movie. And in 1980, she won the Oscar for Best Actress in the movie. I love that story because it illustrates how apparently random events like this can be so influential in somebody's life and lead to such very good outcome. And sometimes you can call it random, call it from God. I think there are other ways to explain it that don't have to invoke the randomness in God, which are not arguable. If you say it's God, I can't argue with you. That's a final cause. And random is also a final cause. And those are the two basic answers a lot of people like to give for explaining meaningful coincidences. And I say, you both can't be right. Okay, so that leaves it at that. But I think this story illustrates something that a lot of people experience.
What a great story. I think a lot of people can really relate to that. And it really illustrates how we get these nudges that are all connected. It kind of reminds me of Lombardi Street in San Francisco, otherwise known as the crookedest street in the world. Sometimes you don't know if you're going right or left, but you're going down and they all connect to the same place.
That's right. That's right. But you're going down.
So, are there different subtypes of meaningful coincidences?
There are 4 subtypes. And I didn't want to get caught up in just one of them, which most people have heard of synchronicity. And also they've heard of serendipity. But this is probably the first book, this book on meaningful coincidence I just wrote, that puts synchronicity and serendipity together and adds a third one, which has been around a a long time, about the same amount of time as Jung's synchronicity, and that's seriality. And then I made up a term, simulpathity, the experience of the pain of a loved one at a distance. Well, simulpathity was triggered in me because of what happened between my father and me when I was 31 years old. I was in San Francisco and in a Victorian house in the Fillmore district, across from Alamo Park, in case anybody's been in San Francisco, where the painted ladies went around this park. I love these old Victorians. They're so beautiful. And I was standing in the sink on February 26th, and I couldn't get something out of my throat. Something was stuck in my throat. I kept choking and choking and coughing and choking, and it went on quite a while. I don't know how long. I didn't have a stopwatch, but it seemed like a long time. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, I don't know. That was 11 p.m., February 26th in San Francisco time. Well, the next day, my brother called me to say that at 2 a.m. Wilmington, Delaware time, 3,000 miles away, our father had died in the hospital, choking on his own blood. He had bled into his throat, and he choked the way I was choking, but he died, and I am here to tell the story. Well, that feeling the pain of a loved one at a distance is pretty memorable. I mean, for anybody whose parent dies, that's a big deal because it means you're going to die too. And to feel what he was feeling, at least some degree of it, was quite remarkable to me. So I wanted to know how common this was. And in fact, if even other people experienced this kind of thing. And that's what the Weird Coincidence Survey helped me do, because we asked people who filled it out, do you ever experience, with what frequency do you experience the pain of a loved one at a distance? And people said sometimes. So I said, okay, sometimes I wouldn't want them to do it all the time or even regularly or frequently, but sometimes. That tells me that my own personal experience was not just my own. And I kind of knew that. And one of the lessons of meaningful coincidences is that if you got some weird thing happening to you, other people are experiencing it, have experienced it, or will experience it. We're not so unique as we like to think of ourselves as being. One of my favorite examples of that was wondering if anybody had come up with the term simulpathity, because I made it up. 2014, I looked through the internet and I didn't see it. But in 2016, some guy had made a brief movie, a 2 or 3 minute movie called Simulpathity. So I contacted him on Facebook and asked him, did you ever hear of me? Where'd you come up with that term? He said, no, I never heard of you. I came up with it myself. And looking at the movie, it was about experiencing the pain of a loved one at a distance. Well, that just taught me, if ideas are out there and we pick them up at various times, and experiences are out there just the same.
Well, I'm so sorry for your loss. I mean, it sounds like a horrible experience to have gone through, but it's very pointed in how it also shares with people the different levels that one can feel going through that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, that's one form of meaningful coincidences, as we were talking about. Probably the most popular in the United States is synchronicity. Synchronicity was a term invented by Carl Jung to describe the explanations he felt for meaningful coincidences. The fun thing is that, for me, is that, since I like words, is that Jung didn't mean synchronicity to be applied to meaningful coincidences, but more he meant it was to be a way of explaining them. He called them an acausal connecting principle, was what synchronicity meant. But as most of us know synchronicity now is a term that is applied to meaningful coincidences. But if you're a Jungian and you want to do the strict Jungian definition of synchronicity, it's a meaningful coincidence that helps you evolve, helps you individuate. Or another way of saying it, helps you interpersonally, psychologically, and spiritually. And Jung was kind of mystical. So it fits with what Jung's feeling about the term was: interpersonal, psychological, and spiritual. There's a Venn diagram here where serendipity and synchronicity overlap, but their differences are in mostly where they are applied, where those terms are applied. Serendipity is happy accidents, where somehow you stumble across an idea that works for you and that you find works for other people. Scientific investigations have been based, many of them, on accidental discovery. If you look at the history of pharmacology, there's a lot of weird stuff has happened accidentally that became very useful in people's lives. The discovery of penicillin is the paradigmatic example of that by Alexander Fleming. He stumbled across the penicillin mold and helped in 1945 to have the West beat the Nazis, because a lot of soldiers were dying not of wounds themselves, but dying of the infections that came with the wounds. And the accidental discovery of penicillin in 1928 led to a bunch of other coincidences that ended up with being able to mass produce penicillin so that the soldiers and then other people with infections could be successfully treated. It was a major transformation in medicine and medical treatment. And he got Alexander Fleming got the Nobel Prize along with two other people who helped go from the laboratory of Alexander Fleming into recognizing that penicillin could be useful in treating human beings. The end of the story I like probably the best because it's least told, least understood, least respected, I think. And I'm trying to bring Mary in this story of more respect. They realized that penicillin was going to be a great antibiotic, but they needed to produce mass quantities. So they wanted to find a type of penicillin mold, it's a fungus, that would produce a lot of penicillin. So the US sent military people around the world to find the best producing penicillin. And they wanted to bring that best producing penicillin to Peoria, Illinois, where there was corn liquor that was able to be a great place for this mold to grow. They liked the corn liquor. And so they wanted to get a good match. So they couldn't find much around the world. I mean, stuff that wasn't as great as they wanted. So one of the laboratory people, an administrator or researcher with them, named Mary Hunt, went down to the farmer's market in Peoria, and she was looking around, and she saw a cantaloupe with this golden mold growing on it. So she looked at it and said, maybe this stuff will do it. It turned out that it was the best producing penicillin mold that anybody had ever found. And there it was in the hometown of Peoria where they wanted the stuff to grow. There's a lesson in that, a couple of lessons actually, that what you're looking for, what you're seeking may be right in your own home or right where you're living. You don't have to go traveling around the world to find it. It could be right there. And that was true with Mary Hunt. But the worst thing about it, I thought, was that she was not recognized to get a Nobel Prize, because without that step in the whole sequence, the producing mass quantities would not have happened. She ended up being called Moldy Mary. which I think is a shame because she was as much of a hero as the three men who got the Nobel Prize.
Wow, that is absolutely unreal. Thank you so much for sharing that story. It's just unreal that things took place that way and she's never really properly recognized. Perhaps that's something that can be righted now. I know they're looking into things differently now than they did in the past. So when we talk about synchronicities and serendipities, are these always positive events?
No, and one of the points I want to make in my book and try to be able to tell people who don't like to hear it necessarily tend to think that particularly synchronicity is always good. It's all good. Well, it depends on what you mean by all good or even bad. It could be good for one person and not for another. Meaningful coincidences are common in relationships, and particularly romantic relationships. The reason for that has to do with what makes coincidences happen. What are the forms or situations that make that happen? If your life is going through some turmoil, if you're stressed, if you're in high emotion or high need, you're more likely to experience meaningful coincidences. There's a lot of reasons you can ask about it, but they're more likely to come through since I think the structure of your life is being shaken and it allows new stuff to happen. So it happens when people are open to romance and wanting to have something happen with them. And a story of a colleague of mine who was at a conference and he met a woman there and they had a great time together for the first day anyway. They had dinner together and talked about what was going on at the conference. And then something happened toward the end of the day and things weren't going so well. So they said goodbye. And the next day when they met each other, they were wearing almost the same outfits, the same colors, black mostly, and some white in each of them. And they were kind of mirrors of each other. And it's fun to recognize that a lot of synchronicities anyway, or meaningful coincidences too, are mirrors of what's going on around you. Our minds are mirrored in our environment. And that's a hard thing for people to accept, that our minds are mirrored in our environment because we think we are so separate from what's around us. But meaningful coincidences are trying to say to humanity that our minds are much more connected to our environment than we realize. We're not just islands here. We are connected to other people, and coincidence shows us some of those connections. They illuminate the invisible currents that connect us as well as unite us. So they looked at each other and he thinks, oh, look, we have a coincidence going on here. It must mean we got something good going on here. And she says, no, it's more like a funeral. She's wearing black. So for him, it was like a great thing. For her, it was like, get out of here. I had enough of you. I don't want to have anything develop with us. And she made that very clear to him. And where it was good for one, he thought, but not good for her. Now, that's a simple, kind of fun example. But there are other examples where through serendipity in an island in the South Pacific, somebody looks over at another mountain. He's up in a mountain. He sees a formation. I think he's a geologist that could indicate that mountain had some minerals in it that would really be valuable for his company. And it turned out to be the case. So they started mining this mineral at the mountaintop, and they began to destroy the mountain. And with all the workers coming in and all the back and forth taking minerals out from there, the villages underneath had their life thrown upside down. So it was good for the company. It was not good for the people living around the mountain. There are other examples that are even starker than that. I mean, but that's pretty bad too, really. One of them involved a woman named Elizabeth Targ, who was a physician who was researching various parapsychological things like healing at a distance. And they were able to do some studying in the 1990s where her colleagues found strong evidence that AIDS patients who received prayers from distant healers of a variety of faith had significantly better medical outcomes than patients who did not receive supportive prayers. And the people who were being prayed for did not know they were being prayed for. So then in 1997, Elizabeth designed a study and secured funding from the National Institute of Health to explore distant healing and prayer as trainable skills that nurses and other health professionals might integrate into their healing work. Principally, the study examined the efficacy of prayer on patients with a rare and difficult to treat form of brain cancer, glioblastoma. This is a very aggressive cancer that takes over the brain really quickly. Shortly after receiving funding from NIH, Targ herself was diagnosed with the same form of cancer. And I think of that as that what you're studying, what you've got, how does that work? So that becomes something that I had to try to think about how that might happen. She was treated with healing prayers and radiation chemotherapy and died shortly before her 41st birthday.
Wow. That is, I can understand why you would question how that all comes together. Are there times when people really incorporate coincidences into their lives? Is that one example of that?
Well, that coincidence was blasted on her. But yes, I've formed the Coincidence Project, which is made up of people who have lots of coincidences. Part of how they run their lives, they expect coincidences to happen, and so in doing that, and I'm the same way. Coincidences become integrated in how you decide what you're going to do and where you're going to go and what's going to be important to you. So yes, a lot of people are doing that, and probably if some of our listeners are as well, and who knows, maybe you are too, because there's a lot of like closet coincidence sensitive people out there. They don't talk about it very much. Oh, I'm so crazy if I tell people about what happened to me. They don't want to do that because they're afraid they'll be called crazy. But remember, I'm a psychiatrist. I've been trained to know what's crazy and what isn't, and how to be able to try to answer that question. And meaningful coincidences can be, if you have a lot of them and they really upset you, they can be part of being psychotic. Not that that doesn't happen, but it doesn't mean you are psychotic if you have a lot of them. So that they are part of lives in a negative way for some people, but for a lot of people, they can be very positive. And part of what I'm trying to do with the Coincidence Project is get people to tell each other coincidence stories so they'll find out that other people have these experiences and that they're not so crazy. In fact, they might also be useful. And I want to see, this is my intent, I want to see meaningful coincidences not just incorporated in individual people's lives, but in the lives of humanity as a whole. The last section of my book has a personal postscript in it, which I talk about the collective human organism and suggest that we each could be cells in the collective human organism. We're part of this organism, whether we like it or not. We are human beings, and so there are many of us on this planet, probably even too many. So let's find how we can be individuals ourselves, but also connect with other people so that we can create a mobile, intelligent, collective human organism that begins to try to do something about the sixth major extinction, which we are now facing, extinction of life on planet Earth. Looks like the sixth time this is coming around, and we are contributing a lot to this sixth major extinction. Coincidences can help us find our purpose and help us find how we connect with others so that we might find a more systematic and organized way of dealing with the climate crisis.
In your book, you talk about coincidences are clues that the mysterious is hiding in plain sight. So what does that all mean?
Just what you said. They're clues to how reality works. And human beings have been using coincidences to figure out how things work for a long time. Let's go back to the olden days, back when we were just running around trying to survive in the jungles and the forests and stuff. And a couple of guys are out there with their spears trying to find something to eat, usually an animal running around out there. And they see a mark on a tree, a strange mark. They hadn't seen that before. And then they go down the road a little bit, or the trail a little bit, or just the jungle a little bit, and they see an animal. And then a couple of more times that happens, they see this mark on a tree and they see the same animal. So it first looked like a coincidence, the mark on the tree and the animal was there, but then they began to put it together that the animal was making the mark. So that coincidence became explained. And once it became explained, they knew what was coming next, even before they saw the animal itself.
That's fascinating. Now, what do you want readers and our listeners to take away from not just your book, but the work you do also?
Yeah, the book is just a means to an end, and the website and Psychology Today and the Coincidence Project are all to try to ask people to pay more attention to their meaningful coincidences, because they help us challenge the reigning view of reality created by modern science, now called scientism, which is more like a religion. And a religion that this is the way reality works. And if you think differently from that, you're not going to get tenure. You're going to get kicked out of this university, is a simple way saying it. Or you write a paper about this crazy stuff and it's not going to be accepted, even though you did it in the right way. Or even just you tell your friends who are maybe not thinking and experiencing the way you are, and they might think there's something wrong with it. So I'm trying to challenge the view of reality that suggests that meaningful coincidences are wrong about this reality, that they suggest that you're missing something, that they are missing something. They are missing. People who think they're not meaningful are missing that our minds are connected to our environment, that we are part of each other, that we are connected to not only each other, but plants and animals. One of my favorite things to do is talk with trees. I get telepathic with trees. They communicate to me, I communicate to them. And people do that with dogs and birds and all kinds of things that have consciousness out there. I think it's fun to think of all us beings here, plants and animals and us, as like God in disguise. It's just a simple way of beginning that we're all part of the same thing, but how we're part of the same thing and what we can do to help mitigate environmental disaster is what I'm mostly trying to help people do.
I love that connection that we have with everything. I think when we get down to that place, we can be so much kinder to one another, to the environment, even to ourselves.
Absolutely.
Well, earlier in our discussion, you talked about the Coincidence Project. I'd love for you to just kind of share a little bit more about that with us.
Well, I have a podcast, and from the podcast, I found people who look like we could work together. And now we are incorporated as a nonprofit in the state of Virginia. And our vision is to illuminate the hidden currents that connect and unite us. That's our vision. And part of our function is to encourage people to tell each other coincidence stories. So we've developed the Coincidence Cafe, where people come together on Zoom on Saturdays, every third Saturday of the month from 11 to 12:30 to tell each other coincidence stories, usually around a theme. And I expect more people to show up there than had been before, because the word is getting out that this is a place where people can tell each other coincidence stories and feel safe in doing it, and be able to find people who are doing coincidences like as they are.
Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Coincider.com, coincider.com is my book website. The last page has a link to the Coincidence Project, which the website of which will be up within a week or so. And at the bottom of the page is the Weird Coincidence Survey. But there also will be a place to sign up for the Coincidence Cafe. And it's one thing to read my book, which, they can connect with me there, or my podcast, but it's a passive thing to read or watch the podcast or see my Psychology Today blog, which you can get to by just connecting with Coincidence or Bernard Beitman in your web browser. But what I want to do is help people talk about these things. And the cafe is our way of reaching out and getting that to happen, and trying to encourage people to connect with each other outside the cafe and talk about coincidence with each other. So that's what I would like our listeners to be able to consider, is joining our Coincidence Cafe.
Well, Bernard, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
You're welcome, Marianne, and thanks for having me, and it's a delight talking with you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bernard Beitman. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Meaningful Coincidences. On that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.